This is going to be a series of videos on the topic of polychords, also known as bichords. This first video in the series is going to be discussing what is a polychord, what are the common ways in which they are used, and what are the potential dangers or things to avoid when using them. So, to begin with, poly just means multiples, and chord just means a collection of 3 notes or more. 3 different notes, that is. We do not call 2 notes a chord because that would be known as an interval, which is just a distance between 2 notes. So in order to have a chord, you need 3 or more tones. So let's just take, for example, this triad, C, E, and G. That makes this chord a C major chord. However, if we were to combine another triad on top of this triad, that would be known as a polychord or a bichord. The most common example would be C major with a D major chord on top, which would contain the notes C, E, and G in the C major, and D, F sharp, and A in the D major. This creates a 6-note chord and a very rich kind of sound that is highly resonant. And speaking of resonance, let's talk about today's sponsor for this video. This video is brought to you by Ojaya Deep Meditation. Did you know there is a powerful and easy method of real meditation that works on the basis of resonance? Ojaya Meditation is a completely online meditation course taught out of the earthborn rainforest in Iowa. This meditation method uses a powerful mantra that not only releases stress, but recharges your energy level like nothing else that I have come across. Everywhere you look around in society, people complain all the time about being tired in the afternoon. And unfortunately, many people resort to these dangerous energy drinks to give them a boost of energy. But unfortunately, these energy drinks do not solve the problem, and they cause all kinds of harm to your body, which shows up later in life. Fortunately, there's a much better way, and that is with Ojaya Meditation. Take it from me, I have spent hundreds of dollars on various meditation courses and retreats over the last 20 years. All of them did not produce the results that I was hoping for. It was not until I learned Ojaya in 2019 that I knew I had finally found what I had been seeking all of those years. It is the first and only meditation that I've continued to do daily. I am very proud to have Ojaya as a sponsor for this channel because this is not just something I am advertising. I use this myself every day in my life. This is something I really use. So go to ojaya.com today and get your first free 9 videos simply by signing up. Now, back to the video. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds too rich for me to use this. I'm overwhelmed. How do I use this in my music? And while you might think these come across as overwhelming to your ears at first, well, the truth is, polychords are actually used far more commonly than you might even realize. You'll discover over time that they are used quite frequently, and just often in ways that are a little more subtle than you might realize. So for this video series, we're only going to be looking at them in the context of thirds or triads, because that's how they are most commonly used. If you go through the piano and play all of the major chords above the C major chord, you'll start to notice that while all of them do have a thick sound to them, not all of them are highly resonant. The C major and D major polychord is one of the most highly used ones in contemporary music because it is one of the most resonant. But take for example C major and F major. This chord only contains 2 different notes in the F chord, as the C is an overlapping tone in the C major chord. So it contains the notes C, E, G, and F, A, C. So the only different notes are the F and the A. Now, the A does add a little level of richness to this harmony, but the F actually just hints at a major add 4 chord, which I've already talked about in a previous video.
Major add fourth.
And if I simply just play this chord on the piano for you, you can quickly tell that it's not a highly resonant chord. In fact, composer Vincent Persichetti called this chord like a dull thud in his book. Nonetheless, there might be a context where you want a dull thud or an ugly sounding chord, so we cannot say that it's useless, but you're definitely not going to see this chord very often. But the most highly used polychords are like the C major and D major, the C and D flat major, the C and E flat major, the C and F sharp major, and the C and B major chords. Now you might also be asking, some of these chords share some of the same tones, or some of the tones overlap. Does that still make them a polychord if these two chords share a tone? Yes, it does. We can still call a C major and E major polychord a polychord because there are two triads that are placed on top of each other, even though some of the notes are shared, like the E, for example. But let's just take, for example, another polychord with the G major over the C major. This polychord contains the notes C, E, G, and G, B, D. This polychord shares the note G between both of the triads. Now some of you might see this chord and think, oh, that's just a C major 7th chord with an added 9th. Yes, you are correct. There is more than one way in which you can label a chord. It just depends on the context and how you're using it. How composers often try to show that this is a polychord would be how they spell the chord. And to do this, they might have one instrument group, like perhaps the trombones and the lower brass. They might be playing a C major chord. Then the 3 trumpets may play the upper triad with the G major chord, and they would spell it in such a way that it indicates polychord. You might also be asking, are polychords only made up of major triads? No. Polychords can be made up of any combination of triads, major and minor, or minor on the bottom with major on top. There can be polychords consisting of 2 7th chords, which would mean that you have 8 different tones in that chord. That's a very rich kind of sound. You might also be asking, can a polychord contain 3 triads instead of 2, since poly means multiple? Absolutely. And composers have done this in the past for decades. I used polychords consisting of 3 triads very briefly in my March of the Arachnids piece for wind ensemble. That's what it sounds like in the piano, and that's what it sounds like in the wind ensemble. There are many examples in history of composers using 3 triads at the same time. Can polychords be inverted? Absolutely. But just be aware that most of the time composers use them in root position. And the reason for this is because when you're using a highly rich chord, it makes it more resonant if you have it in root position. So, what are the potential dangers of polychords? Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever had a meal that had just too much spice or too much salt, and you struggled to finish it because you couldn't really taste the food because you were so overwhelmed by the spice or the salt? I think everyone watching has had that experience. It's very similar with music and harmony. What can happen is, if you have too much harmony for too long, it's too taxing on your audience's ears. They develop ear fatigue, and they may just tune out your music because it's too overwhelming for their ears. It's just too taxing. Your hearing is another one of your 5 senses, and you can certainly overtax it if you have too much harmony for too long. And unfortunately, this is a very common experience with a lot of contemporary music. And some of you might be wondering, why is it that so much of the advanced music in concert halls, why is it so much of it is unpleasant to listen to? Well, that's a topic for another video, and I will address that in the future. But for right now, the important thing to know is that you have to be careful with harmony. You can't have too much of it for too long of a duration. A much better approach would be to simply limit how much you use polychords. Use them in short durations, and then when your audience comes back to it, it's something interesting and fresh. And the other thing is, make sure that you know that your musicians can handle the challenges of them. That's not to say only advanced musicians can play works with polychords. No, there are lots of younger groups, and especially in high school, that can handle polychords. But just be aware of who you're writing for and their level of musicianship. I had a teacher in college who told me once, I never write polychords for younger bands because they will add their own anyway. Now that's a funny joke, but it's only funny because it's somewhat true. I'm just saying be aware of who you're writing for. In part 2 of this series, we're going to be looking at a few very well-known examples of polychords. I am composer Britt Andrew Burns. Thank you for watching. I will see you on the next video.